The small streaks of daylight that pushed through the window felt like rays of fire as they flooded Merlin's room. He awoke with a groan as drums began pounding inside his head and small men wielding sledgehammers began attacking his skull. His throat felt like he'd swallowed a beach, and his stomach pushed waves of nausea through his body. Taking as much time as he possibly could, he inched the covers off him, then rose reluctantly from his bed. Merlin yawned, his scratchy throat protesting the sudden intake of air, then steadied himself by grabbing the edge of his bed in an effort to stop the room from spinning. Ambling towards the door, he grabbed his discarded shirt from the floor and tucked it on, before pausing just as he reached the doorway. He blinked a couple of times, rubbing at his eyes, and ran a hand through his hair. He held himself up as straight as he could whilst the room appeared to walls before him, and braced himself for the impact he'd receive the minute he pushed that door open. "Good afternoon," Gaius mused, raising his eyebrows as Merlin appeared in the doorway. "Pleasant night?" Of course, Gaius could tell. His mind wandered back to the night before, some of it hazy, some of it just plain not there, but nothing involved Gaius. Had he spoken to him? Had he said something to him when he'd returned home somehow? The clearest part of the night had been entering the tavern and interrupting one of Gwaine's famous tales. There'd been drinks. There'd been lots of drinks. And Gwaine had fallen asleep. He'd left the tavern and... that was about it. Merlin was hoping he'd just come straight home to Gaius's quarters, but a nagging feeling told him otherwise. Then again, that could just be the sledgehammers. Merlin's mouth opened and some garbled reply came out, but he couldn't tell what he'd just said to Gaius, unable to concentrate on much else but the throbbing in his head and the churning of his stomach. He took a breath, pinching the bridge of his nose, and tried again, focusing on the words a lot more this time. "Tavern, Gwaine, ale, can't remember after." He almost threw himself onto the bench with his head in his hands. The smell of Gaius's breakfast, or quite possibly lunch, as Merlin had no idea what time it was making him feel all the queasier. "Well, I can certainly help clear one thing up for you." Oh no, he had woken Gaius. There was a lecture coming, Merlin knew it. "You staggered in here well into the morning." Merlin dropped his head in his hands once more, embarrassment rising from his toes all the way up to his cheeks, which were now burning hot. "Gaius, He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what he could say. "You must have been talking to Arthur for quite a while," the physician added quite nonchalantly. That statement sent an ice chill down his spine, which all but cured the heated mortification. Panic flooded his brain as his eyes shot open wide. Arthur? Arthur! He'd been talking to Arthur while he was drunk? Why had he been talking to Arthur? His thoughts were foggy and there was no connecting them together. He tried searching for a memory of Arthur, anything he could have said to him, but there was absolutely nothing, and that worried him. Although he had woken up in his room and not in a jail cell, so that was something. Arthur? He managed to construe a few syllables together that vaguely resembled the king's name. "Oh yes," Gaius smirked, feigning innocence. "He was the one who brought you home, don't you remember?" Apparently, his mentor was finding the whole business quite amusing, luckily for the warlock. Merlin turned cold. He had nightmares about fire. He had nightmares about lynch mobs. He had nightmares about people turning against him. He did not think in his wildest dreams that his biggest nightmare would be spending time with the king whilst drunker than Gwaine. What had he done? What had he said? His immediate conscience was telling him to seek out the king, to find him and right whatever wrong had been done. That was what he'd intended to do as well, for all of one step before his body had other ideas, convulsing and repelling the contents of his stomach and all that wretched drink into a bucket that Gaius had swiftly managed to place in front of him. That was the scene Arthur was greeted with when he tentatively pushed the door to Gaius's quarters open, nearly 2 hours later. Merlin was sat on the workbench, clutching at the bucket, half asleep and looking as rough as a beggar. The warlock peeked an eye open as the door creaked, and under usual circumstances would have stood and started making apologies to Arthur for the drunkenness, the lateness, the state of him at present, but even the slightest movement was making his stomach churn and his head pound even more. Instead, he closed his eye again and grunted some noise of acknowledgement to Arthur regarding his presence. "You look how you sounded last night," Arthur laughed, in a slightly louder tone than normal. "How are you, Merlin?" He sat down on the bench next to him, and Merlin tried to swat him away, but with his eyes closed managed to swish nothing but air. "Been better," he groaned, rubbing at his eyes. He had a million things to ask Arthur, but his brain couldn't make the questions form words on his lips. "Last night," was the best he could manage. "You don't remember?" Arthur did sound concerned at that. Blackout drunk was never good, and it meant he'd have to explain everything that emotional Merlin had poured out to him last night. Or he could lie, tell Merlin he did something embarrassing but usual for the idiot instead of what really occurred, and he'd be none the wiser. Merlin shook his head. "Not a thing," he groaned. "I was in the tavern with Gwaine." He paused, emphasizing the implications of his statement. "Then nothing." "You tried to bring me breakfast, with no breakfast." He laughed, especially after he saw how Merlin had begun cringing. He was, in fact, not even looking at the king anymore, rather anywhere else in the room. "You were ready to rough up the sentries as well." Arthur bit his lip, attempting not to laugh anymore, but the thought of Merlin, especially in such an inebriated state, trying to fight off two of Camelot's finest, was hilarious. "Please tell me I didn't," came the muffled reply. Merlin was now face down on the table. "And then, there's more?" A stifled groan rose from the doubled-over figure. He'd been blackout drunk. Merlin didn't even know he'd managed to stay upright, let alone try and pick a fight with a couple of guards. "We had a bit of a talk and I walked you back here. I don't think you'd have made it back here on your own somehow." Arthur rushed, hoping Merlin wouldn't quiz him further. He didn't need to know the extent of his outburst. "A talk?" Merlin glanced up. "When do we ever have talks? What did we talk about?" Great. Arthur should have just told him they went straight to Gaius's. Merlin was getting antsy. He hated the fact he'd spoken to Arthur and couldn't remember. There were so many secrets kept from him. Any of them could have slipped out having a talk with him. He was so cautious usually. He couldn't believe he'd been that stupid. "Just things." Arthur shrugged, trying to downplay the whole ordeal. "You weren't that coherent." He hoped that would keep Merlin from prying too much more into what happened, if he could leave the whole event at drunken ramblings and nothing more. They sat in silence for a moment, Arthur contemplating what to say next and Merlin concentrating on keeping both awake and upright. "I didn't say anything, treasonous then." Merlin awkwardly laughed, berating his hungover brain for asking such stupid questions. Of course he hadn't said anything like that, or Arthur would. "Well, you did." Arthur crossed his arms, and Merlin's face dropped. This was it. This was the end of his life as he knew it. He'd have to write a letter to his mother, leave his belongings to Gaius, make Gwaine pay his bar bill. "You told the sentry guards I'm grumpy in the mornings." Arthur shook his head. "I could have had you out on the gallows for that." He chuckled, and Merlin let out a slightly too hysterical laugh back. Look, I need to ask you, did you... Arthur began, awkward about broaching the subject with his manservant. Feelings weren't really his strong point. Did you mean... you said something last night, and I need to know if you meant it. You're going to have to remind me, Arthur. Merlin cringed already. Nothing good had come out of last night, and if Arthur was bringing it up, then it certainly wasn't nothing. His heart was racing, and his mind began whirring with all the possibilities of what he could have said. About leaving, going back to Ialdor. Merlin blanched, the last thing he'd been expecting to hear. You said life was simpler there. Another cold chill ran down Merlin's spine. Sure, he had the occasional thought about leaving, everyone must have done at some point, but he'd never voiced them until now. Had he really said that to Arthur? Somewhere in the back of his mind he could recall Arthur's face from last night, and he'd seemed hurt. Did those two things correspond? Was that what Arthur was upset about? The fact that he'd mentioned leaving? He hadn't realized how close he'd come to revealing something important, though. Already Arthur was suspicious, and all he'd said was that he wanted to go home. Did you mean it? Arthur sounded lost and almost angry, and Merlin felt bad for bringing it up with him at such a bad time. He'd never leave. He was here for the long run, and for Albion, and for Arthur. Nothing would send him away. Don't worry, Arthur, I'm not going anywhere. I was just drunk and homesick. I wouldn't read too much into it. The smile he beamed to reassure Arthur didn't quite meet his eyes, and for the first time Arthur wondered how many of his smiles were genuine, or if they were a facade to hide the pain he'd seen a glimpse of the previous night. He'd be watching that smile a lot closer from now on. Was worried? Arthur scoffed, but Merlin thought he saw relief flash through his eyes. You're a god-awful servant. He stood upright, turning to leave, and took one last look at Merlin. Just don't leave, he said, his voice low and the quirk of a sad smile on his lips.